Billionaire grandma pretends as a janitor to find a wife for her only son L. She disguised herself to uncover the truth. But what she found shattered everything. A maid's kindness. A son's cold heart. A betrayal no one saw coming. Can love survive a test built on lies? Let's find out what happens next. Eyes. Welcome to TOCHI Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The mansion was quiet, as it always was, despite the wealth it held within its marble walls. Chike sat in the center of the grand hall, surrounded by imported furniture, soft jazz playing from invisible speakers, and the scent of designer cologne clinging to the air like ghostly pride. He had everything: a fleet of luxury cars parked in a glass showroom garage, his own tech investment firm making millions monthly, and media outlets that praised him as Nigeria's most eligible bachelor. Yet, his eyes carried a weariness that no wealth could erase. The glow of his phone lit his face as he stared at the latest breakup message from a woman who had once gushed about forever, but now claimed he was emotionally unavailable. It was the third breakup in 6 months, and although Chike laughed it off with his friends at parties, it cut deeper than he admitted, especially when he caught his reflection in the glass wall and saw not a powerful man, but a lonely one. Upstairs, behind a partially open door, Madame Grace watched her son with quiet sorrow. At 67, she was a regal figure, always wrapped in silk, her salt and pepper hair neatly tucked under gold-trimmed scarves. Once a fierce businesswoman beside her late husband, she had now taken a back seat, letting Chike take over while she observed from the shadows. But what she saw pained her. Her son, despite his brilliance, was becoming hollow, dulled by years of false love, transactional affections, and manipulative women. Each girlfriend came with a sparkle, stayed for the lifestyle, and left when emotional intimacy became inconvenient. Grace often wondered if she had failed him by protecting him too much, or by sheltering him from the harsh truths about love and loyalty. But now, something had to change. She could no longer stand by and watch the legacy she and her husband built fall into the hands of a woman who saw her son as a bank account and nothing more. Later that night, as she stood by her bedroom window looking at the stars, Grace whispered a prayer, not just for her son to find love, but for God to open her eyes. "If I can't trust what they show him," she muttered, "then maybe I need to see them without them knowing who I am." It was a ridiculous thought at first. Her a janitor? But as the idea lingered, it didn't seem so ridiculous anymore. Grace had walked through poverty before wealth embraced her. She knew how people treated those they thought had nothing. If she could blend into the background, be unseen, she could study the hearts of women around her son without the distortion of status or fame. That night, she made a decision that would change not just her son's life, but hers. She would become invisible. Not as Madame Grace, the billionaire, but as a nameless old janitor no one would look at twice. The following morning, Grace's plan gained more urgency when she overheard a conversation that shattered any remaining hope she had in the circle of women surrounding her son. She had decided to take a quiet walk through the gardens outside the company's Lagos headquarters, her presence unexpected and unannounced. As she paused near one of the patios, she heard laughter, sharp and cruel, followed by the unmistakable voices of two women who had once professed undying love to Chike. Hidden behind a stone column covered in climbing ivy, Grace listened as the women giggled and mocked. "Girl, once I get that engagement ring, I'm cashing out," one said. "Imagine suffering with a broke guy when Chike is out here giving house keys and Range Rovers like party souvenirs." The other laughed even louder, adding, "Please, a beg, let's just play sweet till we get the bag. Men like him are for using. Love is for poor people." Grace felt her stomach turn. Her lips pressed into a firm line. These weren't women in love, they were predators. As the women walked off without realizing they had been overheard, Grace remained rooted to the spot. The ache in her chest wasn't just for Chike. It was for every mother who had to watch her child suffer silently while the world praised his success. What kind of mother would she be if she allowed her son to marry a woman who would drain his soul as surely as she drained his wallet? That evening, she sat in the study with an old friend, her late husband's former driver, Musa, now retired and loyal beyond measure. She shared her plan, expecting mockery. But Musa, with his weathered eyes and deep voice, nodded solemnly. "Madam," he said, "sometimes to see the truth, you must walk where no one expects you. The janitor sees everything, because no one sees them." His words struck her deeply. Grace made arrangements that same night. She contacted a trusted HR director, set up a new identity under a fake cleaning agency, and arranged for herself to be assigned to one of her busiest company branches, anonymously. 2 days later, Madame Grace stood in a plain, oversized blue gown with a mop in one hand and a headscarf tied tightly around her silver hair. Her jewelry was gone, her perfume replaced by the sterile scent of bleach. Her first day as Mama G, the aging, poor new janitor, had begun. No one recognized her. In the eyes of the world she had created, she was invisible. For the first time in decades, no one bowed or greeted her with rehearsed smiles. Some staff bumped into her without apologizing. Others muttered insults about old people who refused to rest. She mopped silently, listening, watching, and waiting. Somewhere within this building, she hoped to find a woman who wouldn't treat her like dirt just because she looked like she had nothing. Somewhere she believed her son's salvation might be hiding in plain sight. Her knees ached from crouching, and her back twinged from bending too long, but Grace, now Mama G, didn't complain. As the cleaning supervisor barked orders and flung a bucket in her direction, she kept her head down and responded with "Yes, Ma." Days turned to a week, and the new janitor became the butt of office jokes. Some staff took pleasure in assigning her extra work, while others laughed when she passed by with her mop and broom. "That one looks like she crawled out of a village," one woman sneered. Grace heard everything, but she endured it all, cataloging names, attitudes, and character. As painful as it was to be treated with contempt, it revealed more about people's hearts than all the charity galas and social media captions ever could. She had expected the mask to fall, but nothing prepared her for how cruel people could be when they thought you were beneath them. What made it bearable was one girl, a petite young woman in a worn-out maid uniform who worked part-time cleaning the upper offices. Grace noticed her on the third day, not because she did anything dramatic, but because she didn't join in the mockery. Amarachi greeted Mama G every morning with a warm, "Good morning, Ma." She often offered her a bottle of water when others wouldn't even share a look. Once, when Mama G accidentally spilled water and was scolded, Amarachi quietly grabbed a mop and helped her clean, saying softly, "Don't mind them, Ma. Everyone deserves kindness." Grace couldn't speak. Her throat closed up with emotion. Amarachi didn't know she was being watched. She wasn't trying to impress. She was simply kind, even when she herself had nothing. Grace began watching her more closely, seeing the little moments. How Amarachi helped the gatekeeper without asking for credit. How she shared her lunch with the hungry guard. How she prayed quietly in the corner before starting her shift. There was something deeply honest about her. Grace wanted to test her further, but also feared corrupting the purity she saw. Was this truly the girl she had been praying for? A girl who could love her son without knowing his status? Could she trust her instincts again after being betrayed by so many in the past? Her heart warned her to tread carefully. So she didn't act, not yet. She simply smiled behind the mop, nodding in gratitude when Amarachi offered her food or kind words. In those moments, Grace began to believe again that dignity wasn't tied to designer clothes or net worth, and that sometimes the people who shine the brightest are the ones nobody notices, until it's too late. Amarachi's presence had become a quiet bomb in the chaotic world Grace now occupied. Day after day, Grace observed how the young cleaner moved with grace and gentleness, despite the burden life had clearly placed on her shoulders. Amarachi arrived at work earlier than everyone else, her slippers worn out, her uniform faded and too loose for her petite frame, yet her spirit never seemed diminished. She would sweep with careful precision, greet security guards by name, and even help a blind office assistant find her way to the elevator. But what pierced Grace's heart the most wasn't Amarachi's humility. It was her constant, quiet acts of kindness toward others, without ever expecting anything in return. One rainy morning, Grace slipped while trying to carry a bucket of water down the corridor. The bucket tumbled over, splashing dirty water across the freshly cleaned tiles. Immediately, laughter erupted from two other janitors nearby who leaned on their mops and mocked her, calling her Old Mama Village. But Amarachi rushed in from the far end of the hallway, dropped her own mop, and knelt down beside her. "Don't mind them," Amarachi whispered, lifting Grace's arm to help her sit against the wall. "They only laugh because they don't understand pain." She gently wiped the older woman's hands and skirt with a piece of cloth she pulled from her pocket. For a moment, Grace felt her throat tighten. Here she was, a billionaire in disguise, being rescued by a girl with barely enough to eat, who treated her like royalty, simply because it was the right thing to do. Grace managed to smile faintly and whisper, "God bless you." Amarachi just nodded and continued cleaning. From that day forward, something shifted in Grace. She began subtly testing Amarachi in quiet ways, dropping her lunch bag by mistake, feigning back pain, and even pretending to forget her way to the restroom. Every single time, Amarachi responded with warmth and care, never once acting irritated, never once behaving as if she deserved anything better. If anyone ever dared speak down to Grace in front of her, Amarachi stepped in without hesitation, shielding the older woman like a granddaughter would protect her grandmother. But outside those kind moments, Grace could see the world weighing heavily on the girl's shoulders. Some days, she caught Amarachi wiping her tears before starting her shift. On others, she would quietly skip lunch, pretending she wasn't hungry. Grace knew what hunger looked like. She had once been a market trader's daughter, had once sold pepper under the hot sun, and knew the hollow stare that came from an empty stomach. Amarachi was clearly struggling, yet she never begged, never complained, and never used her pain to gain sympathy. The janitor in disguise began to admire her more with each passing day. And in her heart a seed began to grow, one that whispered maybe, just maybe, this girl was the answer to the prayer she had murmured weeks ago under the stars. Still, Grace kept her mouth shut. She wasn't ready to pull back the curtain. Not until she was sure this girl could survive the storm that came with loving a billionaire son. The collision was purely accidental and unfortunate. Grace had just stepped into the side lobby of the company's headquarters, arms full of cleaning supplies, when Amarachi, hurrying down the hall with a clipboard and mop, bumped straight into Chike. The folder in her hand fell, scattering papers across the floor and causing a few staff to gasp. Amarachi quickly bent to pick them up, but Chike, dressed in his signature navy blue kaftan and sunglasses, stood still, arms folded, his gaze fixed on her like she was an insect that had just dared to touch royalty. "Do you people just move around like headless chickens?" he barked, his voice hard and dismissive. Amarachi froze, lifting her eyes slowly. "I'm sorry, sir," she said softly. "I didn't see you coming." Instead of acknowledging the apology, Chike clicked his tongue, looked her up and down with disdain, then turned and walked away, leaving a cloud of expensive cologne in his wake and a stunned silence in the hallway. Grace had seen the entire incident unfold. Her heart tightened with disappointment. She had hoped that, at the very least, her son might show basic respect. But she also understood, Chike was a man shaped by betrayal. He had been wounded too many times by people pretending to be something they weren't. He had grown cynical, guarded, and sadly arrogant. But what made the moment more painful wasn't just Chike's reaction. It was Amarachi's response. The girl didn't cry. She didn't scream or mutter a curse. Instead, she picked up the last of the papers, stood up slowly, and whispered to no one in particular, "Even the proud fall when rain comes." Then she walked away, shoulders still straight, eyes still clear. Grace felt a strange mix of pride and sadness. Her son had shown his worst, yet the girl had responded with grace. It wasn't a dramatic moment, no shouting or slapping, but it was powerful. Because in that brief exchange, Grace saw something Chike didn't. This girl had backbone. That night, Grace sat alone in her sitting room, thinking of how to gently bring them closer without it feeling forced. Chike had no idea that she had embedded herself in the very heart of his company, watching him, watching everyone. He barely visited that branch unless it was for quarterly reviews, so his encounter with Amarachi had been coincidental and unpleasant. Still, it had given Grace a taste of what Amarachi could withstand. Many would have run off crying or stormed out with a resignation letter. But Amarachi remained. She worked overtime that day, even helping another janitor clean the executive toilets after hours. Grace saw her again that evening, sitting outside on the curb, eating plain Gary from a plastic cup. There was something about her quiet resilience that reminded Grace of herself in the early days of building her empire. And so, with renewed determination, she decided. The next phase of her plan would begin. She would create opportunities for Amarachi and Chike to cross paths again. And this time, Chike wouldn't just see a poor maid. He would see her strength. The hallways of the company's third floor became breeding grounds for gossip the moment Amarachi was seen sharing lunch with the old janitor, Grace in disguise, one too many times. The staff noticed how Amarachi always greeted her, shared food, sometimes even stood beside her during lunch breaks. Most saw the old woman as nothing more than a pitiful relic, a leftover nobody who should have been retired long ago. They didn't see Grace's eyes watching everything with sharp intelligence behind her humble posture. What they saw was a lowly janitor getting far too comfortable with a poor cleaner, and they hated it. "Is she forming Mother Teresa?" one of the secretaries whispered to her friend. "She's always with that old hag. Maybe they're related. Poverty has different shapes." The words hurt Amarachi, not because she cared about their approval, but because she was already fighting to survive every day. These jabs were salt on her wounds. But she didn't stop. She kept greeting Mama G, kept helping her lift buckets, and kept offering her small bags of groundnuts whenever she had spare change. Grace noticed the shift. The stares, the whispers, the growing coldness from others toward Amarachi. Once, she heard a junior staff loudly insult Amarachi in front of others, calling her the mascot of garbage. Amarachi simply walked away, refusing to fight back. Grace's heart burned. She was seeing in real time how cruel the world was to the kind, especially when the kind had no titles, no wealth, and no protection. But she was also learning something important. Amarachi's kindness wasn't performative. It didn't crumble under social pressure. If anything, it stood taller. One afternoon, Grace was mopping near the lobby when she heard a manager angrily accuse Amarachi of entering a restricted lounge area to spy on executives. Grace knew it was false. She had seen the girl enter only because she had been asked to clean. The way the manager scolded Amarachi, threatening to deduct her wages, shouting in front of others, was humiliating. Grace had to hold back her urge to scream. But she made a silent vow. Amarachi would not be discarded like trash. Not on her watch. That night, Grace made some calls under her real identity, privately and from a separate phone line. She made sure the lounge cleaning schedule would include Amarachi again, and this time, she arranged for her son to attend a small executive brunch the same morning. If the universe would not align their paths naturally, then she would help nudge it, carefully, invisibly. But deep down, Grace knew something had begun. The world had tested Amarachi's patience, her pride, and her kindness, and she had passed each time. Now it was time to test Chike. Would he still cling to his ego when faced with a girl who had every reason to lash out, yet chose love? Would he continue to see status instead of soul? The battle had shifted, and Grace, still clad in worn-out slippers and a janitor's gown, was now a mother on a mission, ready to expose the true worth of everyone around her, especially her own son. The morning began with tension in the air, though Amarachi couldn't tell why. She had barely arrived when she was summoned to the administrative office by one of the secretaries, her voice clipped and cold. Confused and clutching her worn notebook, Amarachi walked through the corridor, her footsteps shaky. In the small glass office sat Mr. Kalu, the stern HR executive known for his impatience. On his desk was a small black purse, its label flashing a designer brand. Without a smile, Without even asking Amarachi to sit, he pointed at the purse and asked, "Is this yours?" Amarachi's confusion was evident, and her reply, a shaky, "No, sir," didn't seem to convince him. "It was found in the locker you use to store your belongings. It contains over 350,000 Nigerian nairas and a staff ID that doesn't belong to you." Her mouth opened in shock. She had no idea what he was talking about. "Sir, I've never seen this bag before. I swear," she pleaded, her voice cracking. But he didn't care. The accusation had already been cemented, and soon the word spread across the staff quarters like wildfire. "The cleaner girl has been stealing." Grace, still disguised as Mama G, stood silently in the corridor, watching it unfold. Her heart twisted at the sight of Amarachi being humiliated, her cheeks flushed with confusion and shame. A crowd of staff gathered nearby, many whispering, others shaking their heads, as though her guilt was already confirmed. One woman smirked and said, "I knew she was too nice. All this goody-goody, nah, just cover face. All of them day thief for night." Amarachi was on the verge of tears, but she held it in, her hands trembling by her side. Grace wanted to step in, to pull off her disguise and thunder at the injustice, but she had to remain unseen. Instead, she made a discreet call to the internal security officer, requesting a review of the surveillance footage from the janitor's quarters. Hours later, when no one was looking, Grace slipped into the surveillance room and demanded, under her real name, to see the footage herself. What she saw enraged her. The night before, one of the jealous staff members, Tina, the same one who often mocked Amarachi, had been captured sneaking into the locker room and slipping the bag into Amarachi's space. The next morning, Mr. Kalu received an anonymous brown envelope under his door with a flash drive and a printed note. Watch the footage from 7:43 p.m. Truth does not hide forever. When he saw the clip, he was forced to summon Amarachi again, but this time his tone was nervous. "It appears there was a mistake. The real culprit has been dealt with." That was all he said before dismissing her. No apology, no explanation, nothing to undo the humiliation. As Amarachi walked out of the office, she passed Tina, who avoided her gaze. Amarachi didn't speak. She held her head high, even though her spirit was bruised. Grace approached her later in the hallway, offering her a warm bottle of water. Amarachi took it and whispered, "Thank you, Mama G. I would have quit today, but something tells me not to give up. Not yet." Grace turned away quickly, wiping her tears before they fell. Her heart was no longer testing Amarachi. It was breaking for her. Grace knew the time had come to stir the waters between her son and Amarachi again. But she had to be careful. Too direct, and Amarachi would feel manipulated. Too subtle, and Chike would never notice the girl beyond the label of maid. So she engineered a scenario both unpredictable and organic. The company's quarterly charity event was coming up, a partnership with local orphanages where staff volunteered to serve food, clean, and coordinate games for children. Grace quietly suggested Amarachi's name to the event coordinator, pretending she'd heard about her from someone in the admin office. "She's good with kids and very organized," she said in her janitor's voice. The coordinator, short-staffed and overwhelmed, approved it without thought. Then, on the other side, Grace reminded her son that attending the outreach would improve his public image. "It wouldn't hurt for people to see you doing something wholesome for a change," she told him during their weekly call, her tone playful yet commanding. Chike groaned but agreed. "1 hour, Mum. That's all." The charity day was held at a large community center near the mainland, and by noon it was filled with laughter, balloons, and 100 eager children. Amarachi, dressed in a simple blue t-shirt and jeans borrowed from another staff, looked radiant in her element. She painted the faces of little girls and made paper hats with the boys, her laughter ringing out despite the exhaustion in her eyes. When Chike arrived in his designer jeans, crisp white shirt, and dark sunglasses, he stood out like a lighthouse among fishermen. He was barely on the premises 10 minutes before he noticed Amarachi. She wasn't cleaning, wasn't mopping. She was smiling, happy, surrounded by children who adored her. For the first time he saw her not as the cleaner who bumped into him, but as a woman, full of joy, warmth, and something he couldn't name. He found himself watching her from a distance, drawn in despite himself. When one of the children spilled paint on his sneakers, she was the one who came over to help. "Sorry, sir," she said politely, kneeling to dab the stain. "They get excited sometimes." He was about to say something curt, but stopped. Her hands moved gently, her voice calm. For the first time, he noticed the texture of her skin, the clarity in her eyes, the way she didn't flinch around him. "You work in our office, right?" he asked slowly. Amarachi nodded without looking up. "Yes, sir. Cleaning department." He didn't know what else to say, so he just nodded and muttered, "Thanks," before walking away, confused by the sudden tightness in his chest. Grace, watching from a distance behind a table of food trays, smiled faintly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She saw it in her son's body language, the way he glanced over his shoulder more than once. The seed had been planted, and like all seeds, it just needed time and a little water. Back at the company the following week, something had shifted in Chaik. He returned more frequently than usual, often under the guise of checking operations, but in truth, his eyes were subtly seeking Amarachi. He wouldn't admit it, even to himself, but the memory of her calm smile and the softness in her voice lingered like a gentle echo. He noticed her again 2 days later, bending over to wipe a glass table in the executive waiting room. This time, he didn't walk past her. Instead, he paused and asked, "What's your name again?" Amarachi straightened up, startled but composed. "Amarachi, sir." He nodded slowly. "You did well at the charity event." She smiled and replied, "Thank you." The kids made it easy. He didn't say more, but something in his tone was different. Less condescending, more curious. That day, Amarachi told Mama G, "Your Oga is not as scary as people say. Maybe he's just misunderstood." Grace chuckled to herself, but said nothing. The next encounter happened 2 days later during a boardroom presentation. The janitors had been asked to refresh the executive table with water and light snacks just before the meeting. Amarachi entered with a tray, moving quickly and quietly as always. Unfortunately, a junior manager had placed the projector cables carelessly near the door, and she tripped slightly, knocking over a glass of water, right beside Chaik's laptop. A sharp gasp echoed in the room. The senior executives froze. Everyone turned to her, expecting rage, possibly a dismissal on the spot. Chaik stood up slowly, and for a moment, his expression was unreadable. "It's fine," he said at last, calmly pushing the laptop away from the water. "Just be careful next time." Amarachi, wide-eyed, whispered, "Yes, sir." "I'm sorry." No insults. No scolding. Just a measured, human response. That act shocked the entire room, and sparked whispers all week. Had Chaik just let a cleaner go unpunished? Grace was pleased, but also wary. She didn't want her son falling in love out of pity or novelty. She needed to be sure it was her heart that pulled him, not her circumstances. Later that week, Chaik ran into Amarachi in the courtyard while on a call. As he ended the call and sat on the bench, she passed by with a bucket and hesitated. "Sir, may I sit for a moment?" she asked politely. He nodded. She sat just for a minute, silent beside him. Neither said anything. But there was peace in that silence. Grace, watching from inside through a window, felt her eyes sting. The walls around her son were beginning to crack. And Amarachi? She didn't even know she had already stepped into the center of something far bigger than herself. The company's mid-year executive dinner was a glamorous affair held at a 5-star hotel in Victoria Island. Velvet carpets, gold-plated cutlery, live jazz music, and the city's elite seated under crystal chandeliers. Chaik arrived with his usual swagger, accompanied by a few high-ranking board members and social influencers invited to improve the firm's PR image. At the back of the venue, near the service door, Amarachi stood in a crisp catering uniform, her hair neatly tied back, holding a silver tray of wine glasses. Grace, still in disguise as Mama G, stood not far off, pushing a cart of empty trays, her eyes constantly drifting toward her son and the girl she had grown to admire. Amarachi hadn't wanted to serve at the event. She hated being around such excess, but the contractor she worked under insisted she report there. As soon as she entered the main hall, the temperature of the air changed. Conversations dropped as wealthy guests turned to stare, not at the servers, but at her. A few ladies leaned into each other, whispering behind expensive fans. It didn't take long before the whispering turned into mocking. One of Chike's acquaintances, a flamboyant real estate mogul named Kelechi, raised his voice and said, "Ah, Chike, isn't that your new assistant?" Chike glanced up, confused. "Who?" he asked. Kelechi pointed toward Amarachi, who was now serving drinks at the corner of the room. "That girl. The one with the broom and the tray. Or don't tell me you're dating your maid now." The table erupted in laughter. Chike's jaw tightened. He looked at Amarachi, now clearly uncomfortable, and then back at the men laughing. He didn't laugh. Instead, he stood and walked toward the balcony, needing air. But the damage had been done. Amarachi, though she pretended not to hear, had caught every word. Her hands trembled as she continued serving drinks, her face burning from the humiliation. For the first time in a long time, she wanted to leave. But she stayed, not for pride, not for Chike, but because survival demanded it. Grace watched everything from behind the catering station. Her knuckles clenched the handle of the cart until they turned pale. After the event, as the guests departed and the cleaners began clearing up, Chike returned to the hall and found Amarachi seated alone near the back exit, sipping water, her face pale. "You didn't deserve that," he said quietly. Amarachi looked up slowly, her eyes cautious. "It's okay," she whispered. "People like them don't see people like me." He sat beside her, silent for a long moment before responding. "I see you." Those 3 words lingered, heavier than he intended. Amarachi didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. In that quiet exchange, something unspoken passed between them. A bridge had been built, shaky but real. Grace, now standing outside by the kitchen entrance, closed her eyes and whispered a quiet prayer. Let him keep walking across that bridge, Lord. Let her not lose herself in the fire. Because she knew from experience that love between worlds was never welcomed, not without scars. Chike drove through the city that night in silence, the usual thrum of Lagos traffic fading into the background as his thoughts swirled. For all his money and fame, he felt hollow. The more time he spent with Amarachi, whether in silence or in stolen glances, the more he became aware of just how little peace he had in his life. Everyone around him expected something: contracts, handouts, favors, attention, status. Even the women he dated came with checklists of expectations. No one asked how he felt. No one ever paused long enough to see the weight he carried. But Amarachi, that girl with tired eyes and a gentle voice, never asked for anything. When she spoke to him, she wasn't trying to impress him. When she served him food or water, there was no flattery, just presence. Quiet, grounded presence. For a man who had learned to distrust everyone, this was disarming and terrifying. The next day, he called off his meetings and drove himself to the company without his usual entourage. He stood outside the break area, watching Amarachi laugh with one of the other cleaning staff, not the mocking laughter he was used to, but something warm. It made him realize something painful. He didn't know how to laugh like that anymore. When Amarachi saw him, she nodded and greeted him respectfully, as always, then returned to her task without fanfare. That simple gesture made something shift inside him. Later that evening, as if needing to release something buried for too long, he found himself talking with her again, this time outside the building as she waited for a bus. He offered to drop her off, and after hesitating, she agreed. They didn't talk much in the car, but just before she got out, he asked her, "Why are you always so calm, even when people are horrible?" She looked at him and said, "Because I know who I am. They don't have to." Those words struck deeper than she knew. That night, Chike lay in bed staring at the ceiling, haunted by her words. I know who I am. When had he lost that sense of self? When had he allowed status to become his armor instead of his truth? The media called him powerful, but he felt like a child lost in a palace of mirrors. Every reflection distorted by other people's opinions. Amarachi, for all her poverty, knew herself. and that made her richer than anyone in his circle. He didn't want to fall in love. He had sworn he never would again. But something deeper than love was already creeping in, something rooted in respect. And respect, Chike had learned, was rarer than gold. In the following weeks, Grace began to observe subtle changes in her son. He smiled more, not those fake press smiles, but real quiet ones. He spent more time in the office, often wandering near the cleaning quarters, without realizing he was looking for Amarachi. Once, he even asked her opinion on the color scheme for a new staff lounge. She blinked in surprise and said, "I think lighter colors help people feel less afraid of the space." He had nodded, considering her suggestion seriously. The staff noticed, too. Whispers started again, only this time, the whispers had teeth. He must be sleeping with her, some said. Maybe she used charm, others gossiped. One woman even spat near Amarachi's bucket and muttered, "Witch." But Amarachi didn't retaliate. She never did. Still, the cruelty chipped away at her spirit. Grace saw it, saw how Amarachi now lingered less in common areas, smiled less, avoided even her. It hurt Grace more than she expected. One afternoon, after overhearing a particularly vicious comment in the restroom about Amarachi's body and her presumed ambitions, Grace broke her silence. Still dressed as Mama G, she cornered the two women outside and gave them a tongue lashing that left them speechless. "You mock a girl for having nothing, yet you have everything and still act like trash," she snapped. "If she's beneath you, why are you so obsessed?" The women stood dumbfounded as the harmless old janitor walked away with regal rage. Grace knew she was getting too emotional, that her cover was at risk. But Amarachi had come to mean something to her. More than a candidate. More than a plan. She had become a symbol of everything Grace had once prayed for. Dignity in the face of injustice, humility without weakness, and love that didn't beg to be seen. And the idea that this girl might be broken by society's cruelty infuriated her. That night, Grace invited Chike to dinner and watched him closely. "Son," she said carefully, "if you found someone who made you feel at peace, would it matter where she came from?" Chike stared at his food for a long moment. "It's complicated," he finally replied. "People wouldn't understand." Grace reached across the table and took his hand gently. "Let them misunderstand. You deserve someone who sees you, not your bank account. And if you let that slip away, you'll regret it more than any deal you ever lose." Chike didn't respond. But later that night, he found himself driving toward the part of town Amarachi lived in. He didn't go in. He just parked on the street and watched her tiny compound from a distance. When she came out with a basin of water and began scrubbing her slippers in silence, he felt something pull inside him. Something unfamiliar and terrifying. He was falling. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid. The office was unusually quiet when Amarachi walked in that morning. Faces turned quickly when she passed. Some avoided her eyes, others smirked knowingly, and one woman chuckled behind a folder as though she had been waiting for something scandalous to break. Amarachi didn't understand the shift until she arrived at the janitorial room and found her locker wide open, its contents spilled across the floor, and a small, red purse filled with bundles of Naira notes sitting on top of her apron. Before she could speak, Mr. Kalu, the HR manager, entered with two security men and gestured toward the bag. "We need you to come with us, now." The tone wasn't just official, it was sharp, rehearsed cold. Amarachi's head spun. "That's not mine," she said instantly. "I've never even seen that purse before." But her voice shook, and in a place where poor people were guilty until proven innocent, her words meant nothing. The other cleaners stared from the hallway as she was let out, her slippers dragging against the tiles. No one spoke. No one helped. The humiliation was complete. Grace had not yet arrived that morning, an unusual delay caused by a medical appointment. But when she returned and heard whispers about the maid thief, her heart dropped. She rushed to the HR floor, still dressed as Mama G, and demanded to know what had happened. She arrived just as Amarachi was exiting the security office, her eyes swollen and red, her face pale. "I didn't do it," she said softly, more to herself than anyone. Why would I steal from people who already think I'm nothing? Grace pulled her aside and held her by the shoulders. Who reported you? She asked in a low tone. Amarachi didn't answer. She didn't have to. From the corner of her eye, she saw Tina, the same cleaner who had once mocked her, peeking out from the corridor with a satisfied grin. Grace knew. She knew the setup was planned. Amarachi was getting too close to her son, too visible. Someone had decided to cut her down before she rose any higher. But this time, Grace wasn't just silently observing anymore. This time, she was angry. She acted quickly, instructing a trusted technician to pull footage from the locker area. This time under her real name, quietly bypassing HR. Within an hour, the truth was exposed. Tina had been recorded slipping the purse into Amarachi's locker, whispering to another cleaner who stood guard. Grace called the head of HR personally and delivered the footage without fanfare. Tina was fired discreetly the next day, escorted off the premises without explanation. But the damage to Amarachi was already done. Her reputation, her dignity, and the growing respect people had started to show her, all gone with one lie. When Grace tried to console her, Amarachi said, "It's not the firing that hurts. It's that I still have to come back tomorrow and pretend it didn't happen. Because people like me don't have the luxury of staying broken." Grace blinked away tears. She had seen women rise, fall, and rise again. But none had done so with the quiet, restrained strength Amarachi carried. And that, Grace feared, would make her enemies even more vicious. That evening, Grace sat alone in her sitting room, still dressed in her old janitor gown, staring at a photo of her late husband. The gold frame was polished, the man inside smiling proudly beside a younger version of herself. "If you were here, what would you do?" she whispered into the silence. She had been so certain that Amarachi was the answer, the woman who could love Chaik without pretense. But after the public accusation and the backlash Amarachi now faced, she began to wonder if this world would ever let a woman like her survive in Chaik's life. Would Amarachi be strong enough to endure the cruelty of socialites, the scrutiny of business partners, the mockery from media that fed off scandal like wine? Could she still remain whole if the spotlight turned from her poverty to her personhood? Grace loved her son deeply, but she also knew how cold his world could be, especially to outsiders with no armor, no status, no powerful surname. Amarachi had been built on grit, not privilege. And grit, though admirable, had its breaking point. The next day, Grace arrived early and watched Amarachi from afar. She noticed the shift, the way she now walked with her eyes lowered, how she avoided rooms where large groups gathered, how she kept her voice down to avoid attention. Her glow had dimmed. Even Chaik seemed to notice. He asked Grace privately, still unaware she was the janitor, "Do you know what happened to her?" "She's different." Grace gave a vague reply, but carried the burden of truth in her chest. She debated whether to step in further, to officially clear Amarachi's name, to pull back the curtain on her disguise, and use her power to silence the gossips once and for all. But another part of her feared doing so would destroy the entire test. If Amarachi learned she had been watched, studied like an experiment, how would she feel? Would she forgive such a betrayal? Could trust ever grow again from such soil? The weight of her silence pressed against her chest like a stone. And for the first time since this plan began, Grace doubted herself. That night, Grace wrote a letter, a habit she had developed over the years when decisions became too heavy to carry alone. She poured her heart onto the page, confessing her plan, her fears, her hopes, and her guilt. She didn't address it to anyone, just wrote as if speaking to God. When she finished, she folded the letter and placed it beneath her pillow, unsure if she would ever share it. The next morning, she woke to find Amarachi waiting for her at the back entrance, holding 2 cups of tea. "You looked tired yesterday," Amarachi said, offering her a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I thought this might help." Grace took the cup with trembling fingers, unable to speak. She had tested this girl more than anyone should ever be tested. And still, Amarachi showed kindness. It was in that moment that Grace made a vow. If anything were to break Amarachi, it would not be her. The revelation came unexpectedly, a cruel twist of fate wrapped in timing too precise to be accidental. Amarachi had been selected by HR to assist with setup and coordination for the upcoming company board meeting. It was a quiet acknowledgement of her dedication, a way to restore some dignity without making too much noise. She accepted the task humbly, not knowing that this meeting would change everything. That morning, as she prepared the executive lounge, arranging bottled water in folders, she heard a familiar voice through the door. Curious, she peeked through the slightly ajar conference door and froze. There, standing at the head of the table, was Mama G, only she wasn't in her janitor uniform. She wore a sleek navy dress with pearls, her hair in a regal bun. Her voice was firm, confident, and commanding. Amarachi's heart slammed against her ribs. That's Madame Grace, the company's founder, the billionaire everyone talks about. The realization hit like a flood. Her knees buckled. Everything came crashing back. The moments they shared, the food they ate, the laughter, the comfort. Was it all fake? A game? A test? Amarachi staggered out of a hallway and collapsed on the bench near the stairwell, trembling. She couldn't breathe. Her trust, already fragile from the betrayal by colleagues, now felt shattered beyond repair. All this time, she had confided in someone she thought was like her, a fellow woman struggling with old age and poverty. But that woman had power. She had watched Amarachi's pain like a scientist observing a rat in a maze. Amarachi felt used, deceived, dirty. It wasn't just that she had been lied to. It was that her suffering had been witnessed in silence by someone who had the power to change it, and didn't. Later that evening, Grace found Amarachi in the break room, her eyes red but dry. "You lied to me," Amarachi said, her voice hollow. "You watched me cry. You watched them humiliate me. And you said nothing." Grace tried to explain, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I only wanted to see your heart to be sure you weren't like the others." Amarachi laughed, not out of humor, but heartbreak. "So I was a test? A specimen? You wanted to see if I was worthy of your son." Grace flinched. "I'm sorry," she whispered. But Amarachi stepped back, her eyes filled with something deeper than anger. Betrayal. "You could have just asked me who I am. You didn't need to break me to find out." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving Grace standing alone in the dim hallway. The very test she thought had passed now burning in her hands like ash. The days that followed were quiet, not in the sense of peace, but in that heavy, suffocating silence that wraps around grief before it turns into rage. Amarachi showed up for work, but something inside her had withered. She no longer lingered to chat with the staff, no longer smiled when she handed out water or assisted the elderly guard with his lunch. Her face was a polished mask, expressionless, detached. Grace watched her from a distance, her heart breaking every time Amarachi passed by, without even a glance. It was a silence Grace had earned, and one she didn't know how to fix. The bond they once shared, built on shared meals and whispered laughter, had been broken in the worst way. It wasn't just that Amarachi now saw her as a stranger. It was that she now saw her as the very thing Amarachi had always feared, a powerful person who watched the suffering of the poor like a spectator at a play. One afternoon, Amarachi and Chike crossed paths in the hallway, the tension between them like a static charge in the air. Chike noticed immediately that her usual softness was gone. Her voice, when she greeted him, was firm and cold. "Good afternoon, sir." No eye contact, no hesitation. He felt the sting of that formality more than he expected. That evening, Chike visited his mother in her private wing, pacing in frustration. "What did you do to her?" he asked, his voice rising. Grace didn't lie. She explained everything, her disguise, her plan, her reasons. She confessed it all, her voice cracking with guilt. Chike sat in stunned silence. "You disguised yourself to test her," he repeated. "You watched her suffer and never once stepped in?" Grace reached out, but he pulled away. "Do you realize how much damage you've done? She trusted you, not knowing you were watching her like an experiment." Grace pleaded with him. "I didn't mean for it to go that far. I only wanted to protect you." But Chike wasn't comforted. He left that night more confused than ever, torn between the mother who raised him and the woman whose pain now lived in his chest like a wound he couldn't reach. Later that night, Chaik sat in his car outside Amarachi's small compound, unable to knock, unable to leave. Through the window, he saw her gently washing clothes in a bucket, her movements robotic. He had never felt so helpless. The weight of it all, the deception, the betrayal, the quiet dignity of a woman who deserved far better, overwhelmed him. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. He played back every moment he'd ever laughed at the wrong joke, ignored the wrong injustice, defended the wrong crowd. For the first time in his privileged life, Chaik understood what it meant to lose something he hadn't even realized he was holding. And it terrified him that this time, no money, no charm, no apology could fix it. Because Amarachi wasn't angry. She was hurt. And hurt, Chaik now understood, was a far deadlier thing. The resignation letter was handwritten, not typed, and folded neatly into an envelope. Amarachi walked into the HR office, with it pressed against her chest like it was a wound she was finally ready to expose. Mr. Kalu barely looked up from his desk as she handed it over. "Personal reasons," she said, her voice flat. He raised an eyebrow, but didn't ask questions. It wasn't his concern. Amarachi left without fanfare, no goodbyes, no announcements. She didn't want a farewell speech. She wanted to leave the same way she came, invisible. Word spread quickly, and some of the staff whispered behind doors. She finally gave up, one woman said. "Good riddance," said another, bitterness dripping from her voice. But there were a few who remained silent, perhaps ashamed of their own complicity. Grace heard the news late. She was in her private lounge when one of the guards mentioned Amarachi hadn't been seen all morning. Panic shot through her. She ran, not walked, to the janitorial wing. Empty. Her locker cleared. The last remaining thread had snapped. Chaik received a text message from the HR head around the same time. It read, "Cleaner named Amarachi has submitted resignation. Exit formalities in progress. No explanation. No remorse." He left his meeting mid-sentence and drove straight to her street. When he arrived, her compound was already quiet. The neighbor told him she had taken a bus to her hometown that morning. Said she needed peace, the woman added. Chaik's chest collapsed under the weight of it. That phrase, "she needed peace," haunted him more than any insult ever could. Because it told him that in all his silence, in all the wealth he'd clung to while watching her suffer, he had been part of the noise that pushed her away. He didn't cry, but his hands trembled as he sat on the curb outside her gate, staring at the locked door like it held all the answers he'd never asked. Back at the mansion, Grace sat by the window, her eyes swollen, her hands clenched. She had not anticipated this kind of ending. She had envisioned apologies, forgiveness, maybe even an emotional reunion. But Amarachi had chosen dignity over drama. She hadn't fought. She had simply walked away. And in doing so, she'd taken something Grace couldn't name. Something that made the house feel emptier, colder. Chaik returned later that night and said nothing as he poured himself a drink. Then, quietly, he said, "I failed her. And so did you." Grace didn't argue. She only nodded, tears silently streaking down her face. For the first time in her life, the billionaire matriarch who built empires couldn't fix what was broken. Because this time, what had shattered was not business, it was trust. And no amount of money could buy that back. Chaik didn't show up to the board meeting the next day, nor did he attend the gala held in his honor the following week. His publicist was livid, his partners confused. The media started whispering. Was the billionaire heir sick? Depressed? In trouble? But Chaik didn't care. He stayed home, disheveled, canceling event after event. His friends came by with drinks and advice, but he ignored them. "This is unlike you," one of them said. "You're acting like she was royalty." But Chaik only stared out the window, jaw tight. She was better than royalty. She was real. That truth echoed in every corner of the mansion. Finally, one afternoon, as he sat watching an old documentary on the strength of local market women, something clicked. Amarachi had once told him she admired women who fought quietly, who endured, who didn't need cameras to prove they were strong. And yet he had done nothing when she was accused, when she was mocked. That guilt now demanded penance. And he knew exactly how to begin. He called a press conference, not for business, but for something personal. His team was confused, but he insisted. Standing before a packed room, cameras flashing, reporters leaning forward, Chike adjusted the mic and took a breath. There's someone the world ignored. Someone who worked in this very company. A woman named Amarachi. You don't know her, but you should. The room went silent. She was mocked, accused falsely. She was kind when no one was watching, and I was too blind to see her worth until she was gone. A gasp rippled through the crowd. If dignity had a name, it would be hers. He paused. And if there's any justice in this world, she should be standing where I am. The room burst into questions, but Chike walked off stage, his heart pounding. It wasn't enough, but it was a start, a way to tell the world, and her, that he wasn't going to let silence bury the truth. After the press conference, Chike made one more decision. He canceled his arranged engagement to the daughter of a senator, a match his mother had once quietly supported for business alliances. The senator's family was furious. You're ruining our reputation, his mother scolded. But Chike stood tall. If reputation means marrying a stranger to impress the press, then I want none of it. For the first time, he was no longer the obedient billionaire heir. He was a man who had tasted what it meant to feel something deeper than wealth, and he wasn't going back. That night, alone in his room, he opened his laptop and typed a single message to Amarachi's old email. It read, I didn't protect you when it mattered, but I will never stop trying to be worthy of your forgiveness. Wherever you are, I hope you see me now. He hit send, even though he knew she may never reply. But in his heart, a fire had been lit, not of guilt, but of change. And he intended to carry that flame for the rest of his life. Grace had built empires, silenced rivals, and influenced senators. But for the first time in her life, none of her power could quiet the voice in her conscience. Since Amarachi's departure, the house felt haunted, not by spirits, but by absence. Her meals were tasteless, her garden lost its beauty, and even her favorite evening gospel program couldn't soothe the unrest inside her. Each time she passed by the old janitor uniform still hanging in the back closet, it mocked her. Not because she had worn it, but because she had hidden behind it instead of standing up when it mattered most. Grace knew she had to do something radical. Not just for Amarachi, but for herself. Redemption, she now understood, wasn't a press release or an apology. It was action. Humbling, uncomfortable action. So, she made a decision. She traveled to Amarachi's village unannounced, without guards, without assistance, without pretense. Clothed in a simple wrapper and a headscarf, she walked through the narrow clay streets until she found the compound. Neighbors stared in disbelief as the billionaire matriarch knocked gently on the wooden door of a one-room bungalow and waited, her hand shaking. When Amarachi opened the door, her eyes widened in shock. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice caught between anger and disbelief. Grace didn't speak immediately. She lowered herself to her knees, something she hadn't done for anyone in decades, and clasped her hands. "I'm here to ask for forgiveness," she said. Not as Madame Grace, not as the billionaire, not as Chike's mother, just as a woman who failed another woman. Amarachi stared at her, stunned. Grace continued, tears flowing. "I watched your pain. I studied your strength. And when it was time to protect you, I chose silence. And I'm sorry." Amarachi stood still for a long time before finally bending down to lift the old woman from the ground. She didn't speak, but her touch was gentle. Inside the small room, they sat for hours. Grace told her everything. The reasons, the fears, the regret. Amarachi listened, her face unreadable. Then, softly, she asked, "Did he know from the start?" Grace shook her head. "No. He only began to see you with his heart. I promise you that." That answer, and the humility she saw in Grace's eyes, cracked something inside Amarachi. Not completely, not enough for immediate healing, but enough to believe that maybe, just maybe, not everyone in that world had forgotten what it meant to be human. When Grace left that evening, she didn't ask for anything. No promises. No demands. She only said, "You don't owe us anything, Amarachi. But if one day you feel strong enough to return, know that my home and my heart will be open." And for the first time in weeks, Amarachi closed the door not in anger, but in peace. It took Amarachi a week to decide. Not because she doubted Grace's sincerity, but because she needed to reclaim her power on her own terms. She spent days in quiet reflection, tending her small garden, praying softly beneath the mango tree her mother once planted. And on the seventh day, with the rising sun casting golden light across her compound, she packed a small bag, wore her cleanest gown, and boarded a bus back to the city. She didn't tell anyone she was coming. When she arrived at the mansion, the guards, now familiar with her name thanks to Chike's public declarations, ushered her in with quiet respect. Grace stood waiting in the hallway, tears already in her eyes. "You came," she whispered. Amarachi nodded. "For myself, not for anyone else." And with those words, she stepped inside, not as a maid, but as a woman reclaiming her voice. Chike was in the garden, watering the lilies, something he'd taken up since Amarachi left. When he turned and saw her standing there, his breath caught. He dropped the hose. "Amarachi," he said, unsure if it was real. She smiled softly. "You said you'd try to be worthy. I came to see if you still meant it." Chike didn't rush toward her. He didn't plead. He only said, "Every day since you left, I've thought of who I was and who I want to be. I don't want to love you because you're different. I want to love you because you make me want to be different." Amarachi walked closer, her eyes glistening. "I'm not a fairy tale," she said. "I'm not looking to be saved." Chike nodded. "I don't want to save you. I want to walk beside you. That's all." And just like that, no grand kiss, no sweeping music, just two people standing in the morning sun. Healing began. Months later, the company's website featured a new board member, Amarachi Nwankwo, Director of Human Engagement and Integrity Initiatives. The media went wild. From cleaner to corporate leader, they called it. But Amarachi ignored the noise. She continued to visit orphanages, advocate for women in domestic labor, and yes, still mopped floors when she needed to clear her mind. She didn't change to become like them. Instead, she changed what they meant. Grace became her fiercest ally. Chike became her greatest student in the school of compassion. And Amarachi? She became the quiet storm that reminded a world obsessed with wealth that sometimes the richest soul is the one who has suffered and still chooses to love. As the story closed, Amarachi stood in the hallway one evening, watching the sunset with Grace by her side and Chike's hand in hers. Not as a maid, not as a test subject, but as a woman who had passed through fire and refused to burn. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.